Hi, welcome to Roses All Trash, the accompanying podcast to Read Community, which is a monthly reading calendar we release about academic texts around theory and social justice. I'm Catherine.
I'm Ryan.
Today's episode is the fourth week of February. It's about heterosexuality. Our first reading is by Viktor Karandashev, Romantic Love Ideals in Modern America and Europe. And it's about the way American culture has shifted to conflate passionate love with romantic love and our really muddled, unclear understanding of what romantic love and romantic partnership is, and also the way that's affected our sex lives with this sort of depersonalization and distancing of intimacy through sex, and it becomes almost competitive or combative. Orgasms themselves were starting to function more as trophies of self-reassurance in a battle with another body, rather than the pleasurable byproducts of interaction with another person passionately desired.
Okay, our next reading is by Pantéa Farvid. Oh, it was good sex. So this was an interview of, I think, 15 women who self-identified themselves as partaking in casual sex. 7 of the 15 women had said they had had more than 15 partners. The study describes them as an eclectic group, but it basically analyzed their language and the way they talked about their casual sex encounters in order to understand their attitudes toward them. And interestingly, most of the women contrasted their current positioning toward casual sex, so their current opinion, with other women's culture or the women that they used to be. And they did not contrast their casual sex attitude towards those of men. They specifically identified themselves as explicitly not wanting relationships, and they used language that has been used around men's quote unquote healthy need for sex. And at the same time, they described themselves as having an unusually high drive. And so Farvid concludes that we should really avoid co-opting language around male sexuality to explain or justify female desire and pleasure, with the added caveat that we should remember that we are constantly rebuilding ourselves. Every part of our personality is a work in progress, including our sexual personality. Another really interesting detail is that while the women found it really easy to talk about negative experiences at length and in detail, they found it really difficult to respond directly with details about pleasure or pleasurable experiences. Farvid links this to the lack of physicality around female pleasure. Like, there's no organ to which we apparently assign female pleasure. And also, when the women described their pleasurable experiences, they always attributed it to the man knowing what they were doing. So Farvid concludes, like, we need to actually talk about desire. We can't just talk about consent or like, don't do this, don't do that. We have to talk about why we have sex, which is mainly desire. Our final reading is by Stevi Jackson, Love, Social Change, and Everyday Heterosexuality. Jackson looks at changing feminist attitudes on love, starting with second wave analyses of marriage and monogamy, as women's imprisonment. And she cites this common phrase from the time: it starts when you sink into his arms and ends with your arms in a sink. But then she points out, today women have and are perceived to have much more agency in love. And in fact, love is a political concept now. It's considered a right that belongs to women and that belongs to diverse couples, quote unquote, like interracial couples or people who are LGBTQ. And then, of course, Jackson points out the paradox that through women's pursuit of love and passion, and this is a real pursuit, right? Like, this is women really pursuing what they actually want in life. Men appropriate women for care work, without which, many family structures would fall apart. And she points out that care work genuinely feels, for many women, like a real way to express your love. And that doesn't mean that we should feel free to play into these scripts, because love is, of course, individual, it's social, it's relational, and it's experiential. We build its meaning throughout our lives, but it is still subject to regulation and constraint by socialization. Mm-hmm. So the question that really defines this episode is, how can we be critical of love while knowing that it is both a conscious choice and also utterly uncontrollable? that paradox is so much more obvious in heterosexual gender politics, where women like kind of have no choice but to seek joy and intimacy and purpose in a relationship with someone who, in that relationship, the privilege will always be skewed. But what's your first reaction?
I mean, thinking about my own personal relationship to love and like my past romantic relationships and how like I believed and still believe that like love is a choice and an action. It's a conscious decision you make. But something I didn't realize till I was like in the moment is that if love is a conscious choice and a conscious decision, then to leave someone is a conscious choice and a conscious decision, which makes it really difficult to do and to deal with. And something like in retrospect that I don't think would have fixed or saved any of my relationships, but something that I wish I had enacted out of love for myself would have been boundaries better, like a critical analysis of even just small scale interactions. Like I like the list is endless of all like small little conversations or small little things where like I compromise because like you just want to keep the peace or it's not a big deal, you know, but those things add up and like you said, end up manifesting into that like ingrained power dynamic of heterosexuality.
It was interesting in the Jackson reading, she says that, you know, people are kind of observing that heterosexuality is going away. Obviously not like as the majority, but it's still receding as more and more people feel free to be in queer relationships. But she said that rather she really sees the heterosexualization of homosexual relationships, the imposition of heterosexual standards and ideas of love and marriage onto homosexual relationships, which otherwise wouldn't be subject to those constraints or, you know, don't have that history.
I mean, also maybe some of that is influenced by the fact that marriage isn't just about traditional gender roles. It means a lot more in terms of like your taxes, your property, if you're allowed to visit them in the hospital and like make decisions for your partner if they're incapacitated, like what you can inherit from them. So therefore the right to marriage is something that's much more important than just like the right to express your love publicly. It has like, you know, long lasting legal implications. And I think that like has to be considered when we discuss about like the heterosexuality of like, you know, queer relationships in terms of ideas around marriage.
Yeah, no, I definitely hear you. Like it's a kind of compulsory.
Yeah. And it's also like people fought so long and so hard to be allowed to be married. So like that makes sense. Although this is tangential, but I guess really a solution I would see to that would be finding a way to separate marriage from some of those more intrinsic rights, like being able to have access to your partner's like insurance without having to be legally married, like Commonwealth partnerships being legally treated in a comparable way.
Yeah, you know, you reflected another perspective that Jackson identified, which is that love is politicized as a right. The only type of love that is okay to talk about is like a pure love that's like not dirty. When there's campaigns around how LGBTQ love is quote unquote the same as heterosexual love, it's like there's nothing gross about this. It's love. It's like love is love type of thing. And it ties in so hard. It builds so hard on what Karandashev was talking about how all like love that is venerable in the United States is like this ecstatic, positive feeling about each other, as opposed to something that's much more balanced and like day by day.
The obsession of purity, I think, is like, or the idolization of purity above else. And I think is a really good point because to accept the fact that like love isn't pure, whatever pure means, that like love and desire are inherently like they're dirty, like they are rooted in our bodies. Dirty, I'm not sure what I mean by that, but like it's rooted in something very like visceral and real and like day to day, like it's something that has substance, and that's something we like don't want to acknowledge because we don't want to acknowledge the like very physical facts of our own bodies.
Yeah. And you know what I learned recently is pretty much as long as the concept of like Catholic purity has been a major part of that religion, so has the concept of Catholic ecstasy, which is like really interesting because it's supposed to be like spiritual ecstasy is better than anything you could feel physically. And so it's like an ecstasy of the mind. And a lot of like religious analyses that are not just, people being like, oh, this is how religion affects society, but it's like people who are writing books about what has replaced religion. They cite this like where our mental ecstasy is hosted now. And, capitalism obviously is a huge institution that has interacted with empirical religion, but also has partly taken the place of it, this like secular ecstasy, this like, oh, finally something is perfect, something like we can depend on robots, and it all has one thing in common, which is that it rejects the ecstasy of the body.
This is tangential, but this like reminds me strongly of my own history with anorexia, and the concept of purity is like very much tied for me, and for many others, though not for everyone. I'm sure it's very much tied into that disorder, because food, like this physical need, becomes seen as something that's like impure or dirty, or like something that like is unclean. Like I didn't want that in me, because then I would be unclean. Like I couldn't consume it, I couldn't touch it. It is like this rejection of like very base physical needs is, in order to achieve this type of perfection, is like, to me it felt like inherently religious, even though I'm not a religious person.
I often think about the shared symptoms between anorexia, specifically of eating disorders, and OCD and ASD, so autism spectrum disorder, partly because I had a lot of sensory issues when I was younger, and it either wasn't big enough of a deal that I told anyone, or it was part of whatever issue I had that I couldn't tell anyone. But like so much of my childhood memories are like hating going to the bathroom, or like hating walking on certain like textures and stuff. And I like it's not dramatic, like it's not like, I don't think it's a lasting issue or whatever, but I still kind of have that. So I completely understand what you mean about the purity thing. And then a big defining trait of OCD and a lot of like psychosis and schizophrenia is that they take their cues from the existing world. So a person who lived in like the 1800s, who had like purity-based OCD or cleanliness-based OCD or like hallucinations, would have had those hallucinations about different things than somebody living in the 21st century, because it's like taking cues from the world around you.
On that note, I did not read the article thoroughly, and I'm not sure where it is, but I do remember seeing like an academic article where they were talking about how like psychologists were studying people who had schizophrenia, and they found that the way people's schizophrenia, like auditory and visual hallucinations, manifested itself was like vastly different depending on the communities and cultures that they live in. Whereas like in places like in Europe and in the US, which are these like hyper capitalistic cultures that are not they're very individualistic, they're not very community based. A lot of the auditory hallucinations were like violent or threatening or uncomfortable and like, aggressive. Whereas people who lived in parts of Africa that were not at all like the US, obviously, where the culture was like a little bit more like community based, with a more of a close knit community, and their hallucinations were like very, very different, and they were like much less violent and much less disturbing. Some of them even like said that they were able to talk back to their auditory hallucinations, and that they like viewed them as a friend, or it was like not necessarily a positive thing, but it was like a neutral thing.
Yeah, I think it's important to like also demystify hallucinations. Like, no, hallucinations are not like entries into other worlds. Like, they are hallucinations, they are conjured by the brain. It's just because it's in Africa doesn't mean that it's like a spiritual whatever. Like, it is.
Yeah,
it's a real person, and this real person has a different working brain.
But like it's like you said, like the way their hallucinations manifested were informed by their outside community and by their environment really profoundly.
Yeah, because I watched a snippet of an interview recently with a white person living in America who had schizophrenia and experienced visual and auditory hallucinations regularly. the interviewer was like, do you see something right now? And they were like, I don't answer that question anymore, because when I say yes, if I say yes, then they look where I'm looking. The interviewer looks where I'm looking, and then my hallucination and the real world are in the same world. And that's extremely dangerous for the person who has schizophrenia, especially if they are like actively experiencing hallucinations. You know, the point is that it's like the danger point is the indiscernibility. That was a huge tangent.
I love how we're talking about heterosexuality and we went straight to mental illness.
It's true. It's, you know, they cannot be separated. Okay, to completely switch the topic.
I was interested in what Karandashev had to say about like our relationship to sex and like the depersonalization that has sort of happened of it. Something I've seen like sex educators talk about is like the need for like intentional touch. And obviously I was aware of like, you know, physical time to be intimate with your partner is like, you know, important to like cherish and strengthen your bond. But like I can't remember who it was, but I remember reading a sex educator discussing about like intimate touch with your partner as a way to strengthen your relationship, but without the goal to be sexual. Like just taking time to physically be with them and to touch them and to appreciate their body and like give physical comfort, but without the end goal being orgasm.
It's interesting that the depersonalization of sex has happened largely through increased agency and increased equity between sexes. That idea of like women bearing the onus now of sexual agency is also touched on in the Farvid reading, when she says that now women not only have to be sexually assertive and like have this sassy attitude about their sexuality, like she uses the word sassy, they also are still inundated with messages about how it's not only physically more dangerous for you to pursue that agency, but also emotionally dangerous, because we're still given messages about women being more vulnerable to like falling in love when they don't want to.
That's my reality, man.
Really?
Yeah, like women giving messages about falling in love when they don't want to. Like that's just what I do.
Something that like I feel that way about is, I mean, how when most women are told to seek validation, and then you're finally getting it right with your partner, how can you not be passive? Like how can you not just wait and see what he does? It's almost kind of like how sometimes I feel like I can't be soft spoken because I am a woman and I am Asian, even though that's like sometimes my personality, or like that's what I want to do, but I can't do it. Or like I'm supposed to be taking agency and being an independent woman, but like I waited my entire life to be validated by a man.
Something that I saw, it's your emotional support lady on Instagram who you shared with me. You love her, but she's talking about how like she's great, but she's talking about how she's like, yeah, I really want a romantic partner. Like that's something I want out of life, and like I think I deserve that out of life. And like we've been taught. I mean, I guess like you were saying, like you and I, like I was raised to be like feminist and like women can do anything men could do and like have this like great career and like you're not supposed to like worry about love from a man. Or I mean, it's not like my parents were like, you should never be in a relationship, but they were like, you know, your career first, like, you know, you first, which was, you know, good advice, but it's also like I want romantic love. Like I do that. And I think I deserve a partner who really cares about me and who really loves me. Like I think I deserve that validation. And it's not that like I'm incapable of giving myself validation, or it's not that I think I'm not enough without it, but I think I deserve love. You know, there's a difference between I'm not complete without a romantic partner and being like I deserve someone who really cherishes me.
Like we say like, oh, everyone deserves love, but I think it's more accurate to say everyone deserves to pursue love. Obviously, you know, I couldn't say that there's someone out there for everyone. Seems just like it doesn't work out that way sometimes. But everyone deserves to be able to like not accept anything less. I wanted to sort of normalize and also problematize the idea of settling. Recently on my Instagram stories, I like put up a bunch of polls that I thought would be controversial, like staying with somebody who you know can't emotionally fulfill you. And the huge majority of people said, no, that's wrong. You cannot do that. And I was like shocked. I was like, really? All of these people think they're with people who emotionally fulfill them? Like, I felt like people were very unself-aware there.
I think people need to normalize knowing that their partner won't complete them or won't fully emotionally fulfill them. Like they can
Yeah.
support you and love you, but like at the end of the day, you're responsible for your emotional fulfillment as well as your broader support system. I know I've said this earlier, but it's like people kind of put all their eggs in one basket with their romantic partner and they expect that to be like the one who like is the key to all of their like self-doubt and their insecurities and their like, emotional needs, but it's really not. That's far too much to ask of a person. Like even if you're relatively healthy and don't have a lot to ask, you have to have a broader network to lean on. So that's why I
Yeah.
think, like, honestly, even the best, greatest, most loving, perfect, like marriages that last 70 years, I think that one person is not like they don't emotionally complete each other or fulfill each other totally because they have to have friends and family and like other people as well.
Yeah, I feel like it's almost dangerous because I know that I felt the pressure to not say anything about when my significant other like disappoints me or hurts my feelings because I want my relationship to come off successful. I want it to seem successful and I want to seem like I didn't settle or something. The reality is like women are telling each other all the time, oh, he did something that I don't think I'm okay with, and then their friends are being like, you should definitely dump him. So then all of these women are telling each other to dump their boyfriends, and then all of these women are secretly just not doing that or going back to their exes. And so I think it's very normal for two people who are otherwise attracted to each other to have different goals at that present moment and different levels of maturity. And like you will have a lot of failed relationships. At the same time, I want to problematize settling because not only is it harmful to the woman often, but it's also very condescending to men. Not in that, like, I believe men are full human beings, which I don't. I think it's,
Yeah, it's like you don't see them as capable of growth,
yeah, which I don't, but like, I think a lot of the time, practically speaking, we have to compromise. And to me, that is settling.
Yeah, I agree. Like, that's something I feel like life in general, but commitment, especially be it to a community or to a partnership, fundamentally takes compromise. Like, you just have to accept it that there will be failings and like your partner will always have shortcomings and not just like, oh, this kind of irritates me. Your partner will be a deeply flawed person. Like, even if they are your soulmate or whatever, and you get married and like, live together for 70 years or whatever, because you're a deeply flawed person. Like, you need someone whose flaws don't enable your flaws, I guess, or who's equally committed to growth.
I was going to add like, oh, maybe somebody who you deem worthy to work on your flaws for, but I think that's bad. I think like to pin something about your objective self growth on somebody who is also changing at the same rate as you is not good.
And it's also like you yourself are worthy of changing for.
There in the previous episode, the Wilkinson reading, the book that she's critiquing in her essay doesn't politicize men's current roles in care spaces. It asks all people to free themselves from the constraints of coupledom and nuclear families while not asking men to maybe just participate more. And then everyone can be free, And I think that is a little condescending to men because it's not like asking them to do something. Like
yeah. It's like a catch-22 because like I believe that men are really empathetic, intelligent, loving people. Like they're just like I do believe like they're like really wonderful and that they're capable of doing so many great things. And so like I want to ask them to grow and to push them to grow because I believe they're capable of it, but also like the amount of pushback
I know
that I get really makes me lose some faith. And granted, like the pushback I get isn't even that strong. Oftentimes when women like ask that of men, it's truly violent, life-threatening pushback. But you are right. By saying like, oh, men suck and stuff, or like heterosexual marriage or relationship is just inherently not going to be like good for the woman. It's going to be inherently patriotic or patriotic.
kind of
patriarchal.
The same thing.
Yeah.
Ooh, did we stumble on something there?
Patriarchy is It dismisses.
We're conspiracy theorists now.
We're going to start a new QAnon.
Oh, no. But yeah, that's the point. Like, unfortunately, a lot of women's desires, because they are socialized and scripted, are genuine, they're real and authentic, but they are bad.
Yeah.
What we want is bad. And so, that's what we have to grapple with.
In last week's episode, there was a line from Bell Hooks that I liked, which was, all too often women believe it is a sign of commitment and expression of love to endure unkindness or cruelty, to forgive and forget. And that's something that, like, I've absolutely done. Like, I found myself doing that, like forgiving and forgetting and like moving on, because I'm like, that's what love is like we let them have their mistakes, and then like they end up making a mistake like 3 times over, and I'm like, okay, so this isn't an error. This is a major facet of your personality. And that's, I think, because patriarchal heterosexual love and those traditional relationships can't really coexist with self-love and self-respect for yourself, like, I mean, as a woman, like, because self-love and self-respect demands setting boundaries and giving critical feedback to your partner.
I know that you're saying that kind of in like a hedging way, like it's an unfortunate truth way, but I would almost take it to the, can a relationship between a man and a woman really ever be healthy? Because it's so fundamental, like the privilege is so fundamentally skewed. I'm hesitant to say that about like interracial relationships, for instance, because I just don't really have any insight. Like between a man and a woman, there's a phrase like, a man can be aware, but he can never be self-aware. Like he can always hear and understand and even give way when he doesn't understand. It is where a lot of women see their own loneliness. The person they want to be the closest to will never get there.
Is that something we just have to accept, I guess? I mean, yeah, I guess like that's something where like many men in my life who I know, like they never really truly get it. And I'm sure there are many people of color who have thought the same thing about me, who like she's never truly gonna get it. But with this man, like I still love them and I still care about them.
And it doesn't have to be between a man and a woman or people of different races. It can just be between two friends where someone does something so heinous and your choice truly is, do I forgive and forget what they did, or do I not forgive them? Yeah. And it like is truly a choice of the forgiver, because it's like that bad and it's that like unforgivable.
I'm sure I've told you about this before, but in Love Actually, this is a slight spoiler.
Movie?
Yeah, the movie. There's that couple. One of them is played by Alan Rickman, the husband, and he like buys jewelry for this woman at work who's really sexy and who's very clearly trying to seduce him. And he has a wife and like 2 kids, and his wife like finds the necklace and thinks it's for her for Christmas, but Christmas comes and she doesn't get it, and she realizes that like he bought it for this other woman, and she confronts him about it, and she's like, what would you do if you were me? He's like, well, what do you mean? Like, and she's like, what would you do if you found out that your husband bought, a gold necklace for another woman? Like, would you like wait around and see if it's just a necklace, or if it's a necklace in sex, or a necklace in love? And he's like, I'm so sorry, like I've been such a fool, like it was just and he's apologized. And she's like, what would you do if you were me? Would you cut your losses and run, or would you stay and try and make it work, knowing that from this like day on, like your life will always be just a little bit worse? And that's how I feel about forgiveness. Like, is it worth the potential positives, or like the value of that relationship? But like some things are bad enough that like that value is forever going to be diminished. Like it may still have value, but just a little bit worse.
Yeah, that reminds me of a part of a stand-up set by this, I think, actually I won't say if he's Irish or not, because I feel like that's like really offensive if he's not, because of the tensions in that area. But he was like, when you find out something life-shattering about your partner, you have to ask yourself 2 questions. Firstly, did this ruin the past, like, let's say 5 years? Was the past 5 years a waste? And then once you get past that question, you have to ask yourself, do I want to waste the rest of my life?
Yeah.
And despite those 2, framing forgiveness as something that sometimes you have to just decide you're not capable of. I feel like there's more instances in my life that I was like, I want to be here. I will forgive them somehow, you know?
Yeah. And I mean, I'm also like, I feel like I've come off as very negative right now. Like, I'm very pro forgiveness. But sometimes, like, some people really do deserve to be forgiven, even when they've done bad things. But there's a famous, like, Dear Sugar, the column, the advice column. But there's this famous one where she, like, all these different women write in and they ask, they're all discussing wanting to leave their partner. Or one of them is discussing having just been left, but they're all discussing how in many ways they like love their partner and he's really wonderful and he's so great and they never want to hurt him and they don't think they'll ever find a love like this, but they just want to go. Like, and like it's like 4 or 5 of them and they all just like kind of have this current where they're like, I think about leaving him every day, even though I love him so much and I don't want to. And what she says is leave. She says like go because wanting to go is enough. But she ends it on, like, Sugar, the advice columnist, ends it on the note. She says, so you have to ask yourself the question, like, will you do it now or will you do it later? And that's kind of something I find myself asking myself a lot with, like, tough questions. I'm like, this is the decision or a question I have to answer at some point, and I have to act on that answer. And, like, I either have to do it now or I have to do it later. Like,
Yeah.
might as well do it now.
I wonder if people in queer relationships find themselves asking that question to themselves. I wouldn't be surprised if they did. Like, even more now than maybe in previous generations. I mean, it's easier than ever, which is literally saying nothing, to have a normal queer relationship.
I mean, yeah, what's that called? The sunk time fallacy of,
Oh, yeah.
yeah, well, like once you've invested in a certain amount into something, you keep wanting to invest more so as not to like waste your past investment, even when it's clear that like nothing is going to change. And that really hits home with relationships.
We're giving a lot of cut them off and leave advice for two people who are constantly staying.
Yeah.
It's
like
weird.
I said, I do believe in like forgiveness and like giving another chance, forgiving people's mistakes, because people make mistakes. I've made mistakes, like, and I've been forgiven for them, and I'm grateful for that. So, but I also think people need to, like, I've come to the point where I'm like, people need to show me that they've changed. Like, you can't just like, an apology is not acceptable. Like, the hard part is you have to have tangible action to show me that things are truly different. And that's really hard to do.
I think we assume it must be simple because, first of all, when we say it, it's simple, right? It's straightforward. But also because we are socialized to believe that care follows love. And I think that is evident in some cultural differences across, like, in love and relationships. Some people are raised to be family oriented, and so service shows up a lot more in love. Whereas in the US, I guess it's more about like how you feel and what you believe. Okay, this is like a lightning bolt of a question to throw in at the end. But why is ethical non-monogamy so attractive to so many people?
Having your cake and eating it too. I mean, okay. I also like, I'll be the first person to tell this to anyone. I'm the type of person who is hardwired to be monogamous and very like a one-track mind. So like that's something I don't think I would ever consider. Like, absolutely no shade. Like, I really just cannot comprehend it because my brain is just it's not set up to work that way, which maybe is my own personal failing, but this is a very broad general judgment. Is when I encounter like women or like non-binary people who are like ethically non-monogamous, they're often like coming from such a place of like care and respect for their partner and their partner's multifacets as an individual, and like their partner being deserving of joy and pleasure and love from different routes, not solely from themselves. And like this seems like this really wonderful, respectful thing. I forgot what the word for, but it's like the opposite of jealousy, like seeing joy at seeing your partner being happy. But then when I encounter ethical, non-monogamous men, I'm like, okay, you just like don't want to be, you want a benefit of the relationship, but without like providing for your partner.
Yeah,
but that's
and
just
honestly,
like,
that might not be a feature of each gender, but
again, how we're
reason
socialized.
why they filter into that, you know?
Yeah.
I would say like I am more inclined to be polyamorous than you are, at least. Because I feel like I place love very highly in my life. Like I place romantic relationships extremely highly in my life. Intimacy with people has a really like conflicting, it like jumps from the bottom of the list to the top of the list all the time.
I think it's also like that's so dependent on whether or not by ethical monogamy you mean, are we in a polyamorous relationship with multiple people, or are you allowed to have like one night stands in your like committed marriage? Those two are both valid things depending on like the setup you have with your partner, but like they're still very, very different, you know?
You know what? I think I found the closing note to this. The reason why whenever we mature in our love and naturally we are less obsessed with the other person and they become less of our reason to live, although they remain very important to us, it feels like we're losing because there's so much value placed on being obsessed with your partner and only being with somebody that you're crazily turned on by. And so every time you're like, well, I think I would let them hook up with someone else, it's like you're losing. You're like, I'm like, I lose, I'm going in, I'm done looking for love.
People like, what's the point of being them if they don't drive you insane with lust every time you start, you know?
Right. Or like what's the possessive point of being close to someone and being vulnerable to them if you don't own them?
Yeah. This has been Roses All Trash, the accompanying podcast Read Community. This was our episode for the 4th week of February. Please follow us on YouTube, on Spotify, on Apple Podcasts, etc. at Roses All Trash, and also on our personal Instagrams at RRRYEN and at Catherine.Shark. See you in a week.